Thank you, Father Benedict. It's my privilege to introduce our speaker tonight. Our speaker this evening is the Right Reverend William Michael Fitzgerald, Prelate Administrator, that is the Major Superior of the Order of Canons Regular of Praemont, the Norbertines, at Holy Trinity Abbey in County Cavan in Ireland. Father William was born in Sydney, Australia in 1954. After graduating from high school, he entered the Norbertine Priory in Perth in Western Australia. His studies for the priesthood in Melbourne, Australia, included graduating with a bachelor's degree in theology the year he was ordained to the priesthood in 1979. And 10 years later, he was back in formal studies, graduating with a licentiate in sacred theology from the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas, also known as the Ecumenical in Rome. In nearly 35 years as a priest, Father William has been 4 times pastor of parishes. He has taught at elementary, high school, college, seminary, and graduate school levels, served as a spiritual director to seminarians, religious, and college students, and within the Norbertine order, he has served as a novice master in 2 monasteries. He has taught at Vianney College, the diocesan seminary in Wagga Wagga, Australia, at the Pontifical College Josephinum in Columbus, and in the deacon program here at the Athenaeum of Ohio Mount St. Mary's Seminary. During 5 years, he served the Diocese of Covington as Director of Liturgy and Chaplain and Teacher at Covington Catholic High School. We are very pleased to welcome this evening Father William Fitzgerald.
Thank you, Father Fernandez. Well, the liturgy being the action of Christ and his bride, the Church, with the Eucharist as its heart, as the fount and apex of the liturgy, gathers up all the different streams of the Church's life. The various movements of the 19th century fed into the liturgical movement and exercised their own influence on the sacred liturgy. So what were some of these movements? The biblical movement, for example, with its analysis of ancient manuscripts in search of the most reliable text, and then the interpretation of the texts, set off a similar study with the texts and the chants of the Roman liturgy. Leadership in liturgical research was undertaken particularly by the German Benedictines, whose influence extended early on to Belgium and France, bearing fruit in the scholarly and voluminous work of the servant of God, Abbot Prosper Gouranger, who lived from 1805 to 1875. His most notable work in 15 volumes, the L'année liturgique, or the liturgical year, in this work, Gouranger, using the best sources available, describes and explains and interprets the liturgy of the whole liturgical year, and while not ignoring the influences either of the Eastern liturgy on the liturgy of the West. So it was a major contribution to liturgical studies. He understood this endeavour to assist in moving away from a kind of spiritual lethargy to a lifelessness and an imbalance which he saw in the French spiritual writers of the 17th and 18th century. He wanted the Catholic people to draw life and inspiration from the sacred liturgy rather than from mystics of various types and from visionaries and various pieties of varying quality. So the liturgy itself would be the source of spirituality. And so Gouranger's book, The Liturgical Year, is available, newly printed in English, in recent editions, and is available online even for modern readers. Not only the biblical movement, but the ecumenical movement had an influence on the liturgy. And the roots of the ecumenical movement, I think, are to be found in the 19th century. Not with theologians and not with church leaders, but with the free groups promoting religious renewal in conscious opposition to the Enlightenment theology and organized ecclesiastical systems within Protestantism. Much of the impetus came from actually groups of young people. the Christian student movement, the Young Men's Christian Association, the YMCA of England, founded in 1844, the Young Women's Christian Association, YWCA, founded in 1854. These spread to Europe and to North America. These groups were supranational, supra-denominational, with a strong evangelical and missionary spirit. In contrast to liberal theology, which seemed to empty much content out of the theological endeavour, these groups of young men and young women wanted to acknowledge, and I use the very words that they say, Jesus Christ in accordance with Scripture as their God and Saviour. That's a kind of position statement of the YMCA in Paris in 1855, to acknowledge Jesus Christ in accordance with Scripture as their God and Saviour. Later, this would become the basic formula for the World Council of Churches. It was in these youth movements that the leaders of the future 20th century ecumenical movement were formed and came to maturity. And so the movement for reconciliation of communities on various sides of the Reformation divide had its impact on Catholic worship in greater use of Scripture, for example. Scripture read in the vernacular, in greater encouragement of the liturgical assembly in vocal participation, the use of vernacular hymnody even at Mass, more emphasis on preaching from the Scriptures, and a more horizontal rather than vertical approach to worship. Now, some of these things were good and some not so good, but we can see the influence of the ecumenical movement on Catholicism. Finally, in the 19th century, with the rise of the anti-clerical regimes in Spain, Italy, France, parts of Germany and Belgium, many groups of lay Catholics were formed to protect Catholicism and to protect Catholics, and to foster a Catholic influence on society and on Catholic apologetics to address society. Now, the laity had already been galvanized in previous centuries into making an impact on society, particularly through the third orders, or the tertiaries, of various religious institutes. But this was a new impetus emerging, which came to be called Catholic action, later to be termed lay apostolate, and now with the much more ambiguous term lay ministry. The whole church was to be more engaged in the mission of the gospel. In this development, we find another significant influence on the sacred liturgy, inviting greater lay participation in the liturgy. Now, when one considers the 25-year reign of Pope Leo XIII, so we're getting towards Pius X now, which is where we're supposed to begin, but when we consider the 25-year reign of Pope Leo XIII and ask what the state of the liturgy was at the end of his reign, the most immediate thing that might spring to mind when we talk about Leo XIII are the so-called Leonine prayers, which he introduced to be said at the end of Mass. Initially, their intention was not the conversion of Russia, which people often said those prayers were about, but was rather to restore tranquility to the Catholic, it was rather to restore the temporal sovereignty of the Holy See. That was initially what Leo's prayers at the end of Mass were about, to restore the temporal sovereignty of the Holy See. Now, after 1929, with the Lateran Treaty, that issue was decided. So Pius XI altered the intention of the so-called Leonine prayers, and he was praying that tranquility be restored to the Catholic people of Russia and their freedom to profess the Catholic faith. and thus the term prayers for the conversion of Russia became the name of those prayers said after Mass at the end of Low Mass, the Hail Holy Queen, and the other prayers for the conversion of Russia. The Leonine prayers were suppressed in March 1965. More important by far, though, was Pope Leo XIII's encouragement of frequent reception of Holy Communion. The spiritual situation into which Pope Leo entered was characterized in some ways by a kind of Jansenistic spirit, which had a rather grim view of the extreme sinfulness of people and set a very high moral bar for those who would approach for Holy Communion. Many of the faithful, with a firm belief in the Eucharistic real presence, felt much more comfortable adoring the Eucharist than receiving the Eucharist. Pope Leo ruled that superiors of religious could not restrict the dates on which their confreres and consuls could receive Holy Communion, and that any existing rules to that effect would no longer have force. So in some religious orders, the superior would say, on Tuesday and Friday this week, you can receive communion, but on no other day. So Leo said, no more of that. No more of that. Near the end of his pontificate, on the 28th of May 1902, he issued an encyclical Mire Caritas, encouraging the faithful to receive Holy Communion frequently. In this way, Pope Leo paves the way for the reception of the Eucharist to become central to Catholic life. And with that understanding and appreciation in place, the liturgical movement of the 20th century could begin. So Pope Pius X, 1903 to 1914, St. Pius X, the landmark document of St. Pius X on the liturgy was his motu proprio, Tra le Sollicitudini, of November the 2nd, 1903, in the first year of his 11-year pontificate. That document is considered to be the founding document of the liturgical movement, and he presented it as a juridical code of sacred music he said to be scrupulously observed by all. 2014 marks the centenary of his death. His heavenly Dies Natalis, or birthday. In the popular mind, St. Pius X is remembered for lowering the age for reception of First Holy Communion to the age of reason. So now 7-year-olds could receive Holy Communion. And for his firm response to the modernist crisis. Also, he's remembered for his promotion, not just of frequent communion, but daily communion among the faithful. For setting in motion in 1904, the compilation of the first ever definitive code of canon law, promulgated by his successor, Benedict XV, in 1917. And it remained in force until Advent 1983. And the current revised Code of Canon Law replaced it. Now, an instrument that makes an assessment of Tra le Sollicitudini is a chirograph of St. John Paul II, written for the centenary of Tra le Sollicitudini in November the 22nd, 2003. St. John Paul understands that document as part of an overall program of Pius X's pontificate. And his motto was to restore all things in Christ. The true genius of St. Pius is seen in his statement, and I quote, that the faithful assemble to draw that spirit from its primary and indispensable source, that is, from active participation in the sacred mysteries and in the public and solemn prayer of the Church. So what Gouranger was speaking about, Pius X, in a sense, baptizes with the papal magisterium in Tra le Sollicitudini. He states what might seem to many now the obvious, yet one might well wonder if the liturgy is understood today as the primary and indispensable source of the true Christian spirit. The restoration of sacred music, defined as being an integral part of the solemn liturgy, glorifying God and edifying the people through enhancing with beauty the meaning of the texts, is so that they might, through active participation in the music of the liturgy, be disposed to receive the fruits of the holy mysteries. So, Trale Solicitudini, drawing from that document, St. John Paul II speaks of the ministerial function of liturgical song, providing musical comment on the sacred scriptures. And so he takes up again the insistence of Pius X on the holiness of the music to be performed in the church. And the holiness, he says, of the music of the church is defined in reference to its intrinsic link with the liturgical action. And so music is holy if it's actually linked to what's happening in the liturgy. That's the essence of its holiness. Such holiness he contrasts to what he calls profane music. Literally, music from outside the temple is the meaning of profane. The criteria, he says, is the sense of prayer and dignity and beauty to be maintained in the liturgical music, and excluding the profane and theatrical forms, he says. And Pope John Paul II said that this should be applied today, to exclude music which is unsuitable for liturgical celebrations. And he reiterates the insistence of Pius X of music of sound form and true artistry. The music needs to serve the text and respect the liturgical context of the time and the movement of the rite. And he reiterates the criteria of Trale Solicitudini with regard to universality, that a person from any culture or nation hearing the music of the liturgy would receive an impression of goodness of hearing the music used in the liturgy. So these were some of the criteria that St. Pius X presented. He places Gregorian chant as the musical form which grew up in the Roman Rite. And he says that Gregorian chant is the native music of the Rite, and it's that which is best suited to the Roman Rite. It places the texts in their centrality and gives them musical expression. So the chant serves the text and expresses the text. Gregorian chant, he says, preserved and guarded carefully down the ages the supreme model of liturgical music for the Roman Rite. Then the singing of part music, polyphony, follows closely on from the Gregorian model, and he praises polyphonic music too and recommends it. And while allowing for the use also of more modern forms of music which are truly suitable to the criteria of holiness, soundness of form, and universality. Another emphasis he explains with quite some detail is that the liturgical form and function of the various parts of the liturgy is to be respected. The introit entrance music is different to the Gloria. Both are different from the Alleluia chant, and so forth. Each part should express what its function is in the liturgy. And these considerations provide a practical example of how music is to be the handmaiden of the liturgy, but not its mistress. Sometimes we find music is the mistress of the liturgy, not the handmaid. In Trale Solicitudini, St. Pius underlines the ministerial function of music in the liturgy by expressing the preference for a choir of clerics, or in their place, choirs of men and boys dressed liturgically and in discreet must not be overly drawn out and disproportionately long. While giving a reminder that liturgical music is vocal music, Pope Pius allowed for the use of the organ to sustain the singing and to complement the singing. Pianos and instruments he describes as frivolous, such as drums, cymbals, and the like, he said, are excluded from the liturgy. Though with the bishop's permission, instruments truly suited to the liturgy can be used judiciously. Already he proposes the institution of a diocesan commission for liturgical music, way back at the beginning of the 20th century. Alongside this body composed of competent people, he says there should be higher schools of sacred music for the instruction and formation of choir masters, organists, and singers according to the true principles of sacred art. He insists that seminaries and Catholic institutions cultivate with diligence and love encouragement and praise of the development of Gregorian chant and polyphony, and he mentions the formation of a schola cantorum, a singing school with its associated choir, so that polyphony and good liturgical music could be fostered, he says, not only in cathedrals and larger churches, but even smaller churches and country parishes. Seminaries, he said, are to make the students well aware of these principles, which are necessary, he argued, for a full ecclesiastical education. 100 years after his death, we may recognize many themes he put forward as foundational for the unfolding of the liturgical movement in the 20th century right up to our own time. We may be conscious as well as those parts of his vision which have been neglected. There are 9 more popes on the way until we arrive at Pope Francis, so I better get moving. The passing of Pope St. Pius X, and the accession of Pope Benedict XV was, we recall, the year that the First World War broke out. Much of Pope Benedict's pontificate was taken up with the war, with trying to make peace, to win concessions, to aid those broken by the war. He was able to bring to conclusion the production of the first Code of Canon Law begun by St. Pius X, and which he promulgated in 1917. He emphasized as well the training of native clergy in the missionary areas, and he promoted relations with the Christian East and the founding of the Oriental Institute and the Sacred Congregation for the Eastern Rites in Rome. While he did not issue any documents on the liturgy, Pope Benedict XV promoted the teaching of his predecessor by continuing to encourage active participation of the faithful in the liturgical rites. It was in his pontificate that much liturgical publication flourished, with periodicals, magazines, and books. Courses and study weeks on the liturgy were open to all takers, and they began to be held. In the final year of his reign, a large group of young people attending a low mass he celebrated in St. Peter's said the Credo and the Paternoster along with him. More and more people were using the Missal and its Latin texts opposite the vernacular. And so they were able consciously to take part in the prayers and the readings of the liturgy. I make the observation here that there are people who say before Vatican II no one knew what was going on at Mass. Well, my grandparents and great-parents could read and write, and they knew and were proud of and loved their missals, and they knew exactly what was being said because they read it as it was being prayed. So I really reject the nonsense that people didn't know what was going on in the liturgy, even if they didn't know Latin. And congresses were held in his pontificate that emphasized the theme of the engagement of the laity in what was happening in the sacred liturgy. The principal contribution to the liturgical life of the Church given by the next Pope, Pius XI, who reigned from 1922 to 1939, was his apostolic constitution Divini Cultus in the 6th of his 17-year reign, on December the 20th, 1928, commemorating the 25th anniversary of Tra Lei Solicitudini of St. Pius X. While he rejoiced in the good and effective implementation of the prescriptions of Tra Lei Solicitudini, he deplored the lack of observance of them and the missing pastoral results, especially by those who considered that Tra Lei Solicitudini did not apply to them. Pius XI recalled the 900th anniversary of the monk Guido of Arezzo, who by devising a system of written notation to set down the chants of the liturgy, made a vast contribution both to the Church and to culture. For the first time, there was a system to actually write down the notes that one heard by using 4 lines of music and a place indicating where the home note, or do, was to be found. And so this was the beginning of the writing of music. And we have to thank a monk for that, despite what some of the historians call the ages of monkish ignorance and superstition. So, Pius presented new norms called for by numerous congresses and meetings for bishops and ordinaries as custodians of the liturgy. He called for an early and timely instruction of all seminarians in religious information, which can be built on as they proceed. He says if you start them singing in tune early enough, you might save kind of a catastrophe in sound. He kind of had a funny few little observations there. So, early and timely instruction in chant for all seminarians in religious information. He calls for brief, regular, even daily practice of the liturgical chants in seminaries and formation houses. He speaks in detail of the celebration of the choral office, not only by religious, but also by the clergy of cathedrals, basilicas, and collegiate churches. He speaks also for the role of cantor in the various churches to oversee the observance of the rules for choral celebration. He speaks of the establishment and formation of choirs and of choir schools for boys, not only in greater churches and cathedrals, but parish churches as well. He stresses the excellence and preference in liturgical music of the vocal rather than the instrumental. He speaks of the organ as a worthy adjunct to the liturgy, both for accompaniment and the playing of solo harmonious music at the prescribed times, and he encourages the development of all that concerns the organ. He speaks of the faithful taking a more active part in divine worship, singing the appropriate chants, singing alternately with the clergy and the choir, and not being detached and silent spectators, making no answer to the public prayers, or answering them in a more than a low and subdued manner. So he's talking of vocal participation. He presents instruction of the people in matters liturgical and musical by the clergy and other trained persons as a matter closely associated with Christian doctrine. The Church's educational institutions and sodalities are presented as venues for such instruction. He speaks of the need for numerous trained teachers, and he encouraged the work of institutions providing liturgical and musical training. He invites bishops to send students to the Pontifical School of Higher Music, founded in Rome in 1910. He concludes with a very strong reminder to bishops to encourage and stimulate these initiatives. The Venerable Pope Pius XII reigned for 19 years, between 1939 and 1958. He provided much of the immediate background to the Second Vatican Council in around 40 encyclicals and numerous other documents. Most significant in the work of Venerable Pius XII was Mystici Corporis on the Church as the mystical body of Christ. Just check the Vatican II Lumen Gentium on the Church and see how many footnotes there are to Mystici Corporis. He speaks about he writes Divino Afflante Spiritu, promoting ecclesial biblical studies. I say ecclesial biblical studies because he says the scripture should be studied within the context of the church and her principles. Mediate Dei on the sacred liturgy. Humani Generis on some opinions threatening to undermine the foundations of Catholic doctrine. Musicae Sacrae on sacred music. Orientales Ecclesias on the condition of the Eastern churches. And Miranda Prorsus on cinema, radio, and television. All these became important footnotes to the work of the Second Vatican Council and the 16 documents produced by the Second Vatican Council. The encyclical Mediate Dei of November 20th, 1947, the 9th year of the pontificate of Pope Pius XII, was especially important in that he addressed the whole scope of the Church's liturgy in 210 articles. He begins by stating that the liturgy is the activity of Jesus Christ, the priest, and his mystical body, the Church. He acknowledges the contribution of the Order of St. Benedict to the scholarly examination of the liturgy. He rejoices in the progress which has been made in understanding and practice of the liturgy, while he deplores defective, theologically erroneous, and the imprudent imposition of novelties in liturgical celebration. Beginning at Article 16, Pope Pius gives a biblical grounding for the liturgy in the Old and the New Covenants. In number 20, he defines the liturgy as the public worship which our Redeemer, as head of the Church, renders to the Father, as well as the worship which the community of the faithful renders to its founder, and through him to the Heavenly Father. It is, in short, the worship rendered by the mystical body of Christ in the entirety of its head and members. End of quote. After a brief treatment of the early liturgy, Pope Pius explains how the whole spiritual life of the believer is marked from baptism onward by the celebration of the sacraments. Beginning at Article 23, Pope Pius explores the interior and exterior dimensions of worship, and he gives priority to the interior dimension. For the Christian life is to live in Christ and to give ourselves with him and in him to the Father. The mind and the heart are turned to God in the first place, and this adoration is expressed through the senses in the external rites of the Church. So the internal is the most important, and it's expressed in the external. In Articles 57 to 59, Pope Pius explains why the ordering of the liturgy depends on the authority of the teaching church. Moving on, he defends the use of Latin as a sign of unity and the guarantee of orthodox content in liturgical texts, because you can't really mess much with Latin when you say it, whereas you can mess with your own language. There's not too many who are able to mess with the Latin texts. And so he talks about the use of the vernacular languages may be pastorally advantageous within certain limits and with proper approval. In Articles 61 to 65, he exposes exaggerated and senseless antiquarianism, and he exposes its fascination for ancient forms and practices simply because they're ancient. Does that necessarily make them better? And so he rejects antiquarianism. And he says that antiquarianism rejects the idea of legitimate liturgical development that has resulted from the inspiration and guidance of the Holy Spirit. Beginning at Article 66 and continuing to 137, Pope Pius recapitulates the Church's doctrine on the nature of the Holy Eucharist as a central act of the Church's worship, and the office of priests celebrating Mass, and the manner in which the laity offer the Mass with the priest, but through his ministry, which is uniquely his. He commends the various ways in which the faithful should join in the offering, by the use of missals, singing the chants of the Mass Common, and taking part in other singing, answering aloud in song the dialogues of the Mass, and even in spoken manner at the dialogue low mass. He allows that some worshippers are less able than others to join in the vocal parts of the liturgy, and he says that they should be left to participate in peace as they are able. He stresses the reception of Holy Communion as an integral part of the sacrifice and recommends communicating the people from hosts consecrated at the Mass being celebrated. He allows for distribution of communion outside of Mass for just causes, and he praises worship of the Eucharistic presence of Christ in various forms of Eucharistic devotion, with special mention of benediction of the Blessed Sacrament. Beginning at Article 138, Pope Pius treats liturgical time, since it engages all aspects and phases of human life, and in a certain sense enables the believer to pray always and not lose heart, according to St. Luke. At Article 141, and continuing to 150, he discusses the excellence of the divine office, gives a very brief history. He speaks of the value of the Psalms and the value of the office in the prayer of monastics, as well as of priests, and also of the laity. He passes on to considerations of the liturgical year, and he presents the phases of the Lord's life for the meditation of the faithful. He concludes at 170 his consideration of liturgical time, which, he says, each year brings the mystery of Christ alive for the faithful and enables them to participate in the mystery of Christ. Pope Pius saw no opposition between the liturgy and popular devotions. He recommends the Rosary, meditation, examination of conscience, enclosed retreats, and visits to the Blessed Sacrament. He insists that the churches should be open so the faithful can find a place to pray. And he encourages frequent use of the sacrament of penance and what he calls the confession of devotion. In recommending retreats, he praises the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius of Loyola as admirable in their efficacy. He encourages the various traditional devotions, such as novenas, triduums, and the Way of the Cross, but he adds that they should be informed by the spirit of the liturgy. From Article 188, he begins a discussion of true and genuine liturgical arts, which he says should be informed by three characteristics. We recognize Pius X again. Sacredness, abhorring profane influences, nobility, distinguishing true and genuine art, and universality, which he says also reveals the unity of the Catholic faith. He treats of the proper adornment of churches and altars, vestments, liturgical furnishings, and genuine relics. Nothing causing derision or lessening the dignity of worship is to be employed. He expresses pleasure where the musical norms of Popes Pius X and XI have been implemented, and he directs that these prescriptions and prohibitions still hold force. He asks that bishops promote congregational singing at the proper times, since it stirs up faith and piety and enhances the unity of mind and heart of the children of one Father. Similar norms apply, he says, in Article 195 to architecture, sculpture, and painting. While approving of fine expressions of modern art, he rejects anything which offends Christian taste, modesty, and devotion. From Article 198, he speaks of the need for proper liturgical formation for various groupings with a view ultimately to a deeper union with Christ through well-formed liturgy. He speaks of boys from all classes of society trained to serve at the altar punctually, reverently, and regularly. And he says this would be a great source for future priestly vocations. He asks that liturgical formation be provided to all groups of the faithful by sermons, conferences, lectures, and study weeks with the aid of lay participants in Catholic action. And he closes with a warning against subtle but dangerous errors of a false mysticism and quietism, which would discourage the faithful from liturgical engagement and exaggerated attachment to liturgical antiquarianism. Finally, he cautions against those who drag their feet and those who rush ahead. And he counsels obedience to the church's pastors, who have the duty to regulate the liturgical life of the church. The other matters of liturgical development coming from the pontificate of Pius XII were the Eucharistic fast, no longer required, though recommended, from midnight, but the required period was now 3 hours from food and 1 hour from liquids other than water, and now water could be taken at any time. The possibility of the reduced fast now allowed for the introduction of evening masses, since the priest only had to fast for 3 hours before celebrating. It was possible to celebrate even in the evening. Pope Pius allowed for greater use of vernacular languages in the administration of the sacraments. In 1951, he allowed for the experimental celebration of the Easter Vigil at midnight on Holy Saturday, instead of the practice in vogue for over 800 years of bringing the celebration forward to Saturday morning. So many people before that, were used to the Easter Vigil being on Saturday morning rather than at midnight. In 1955, he introduced a new rite for Holy Week. In 1955, he introduced the reform of the Roman calendar and its rubrics, which consisted in a certain simplification. Only 3 of 18 octaves of the great feasts remained. He eliminated around half the existing vigils in the calendar. The number of proper last Gospels was radically reduced to just 2 occasions, the third Mass on Christmas Day and on Palm Sunday. He also slightly simplified the manner of ranking feasts. St. John XXIII, Pope from 1958 to 1963, issued a new typical edition of the Roman Missal in 1962. It incorporated the revised Code of Rubrics, which Pius XII's commission had prepared, and which Pope John XXIII made obligatory from the 1st of January 1961. He authorized the removal of the adjective perfidus, or perfidious, in the Good Friday prayer referring to the Jewish people. And he inserted the name of St. Joseph into the canon of the Mass, thereby invoking the irritation of some traditionalists who saw that as an innovation in the canon since the year 605 and the death of Gregory the Great. As we know, Pope John presided over the first session of the Council, which was then continued by Pope Paul VI in its 3 subsequent sessions. Apart from promulgating the Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy on December the 4th, 1963, the Venerable Pope Paul VI's 15-year pontificate saw to the publication of various apostolic constitutions, promulgating not only the new Roman Missal in 1969, but the various rites for the sacraments, apostolic letters on the replacement of the minor orders with the lay ministries of lector and acolyte, the combining of the congregations for liturgy and sacraments, the permanent diaconate, the choral obligation of clerical religious bound to choir office, and the maintenance of the chant, the encyclical Mysterium Fidei in 1965 for the correct implementation of the Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy. Now what's interesting is Pope Paul again and again issues documents for the correct implementation of the Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy. And that seemed to be a need to keep talking about the correct implementation of the Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy. So he spoke many times about the Sacred Liturgy, and he authorized numerous documents from the Congregation for Divine Worship and Discipline of the Sacraments on proper implementation. Those proper implementation documents continued through the pontificate of St. John Paul II. 27-year pontificate of St. John Paul II saw to the completion of the post-conciliar revision of the liturgical books, with the ceremonial of bishops, the Book of Blessings, and the new Roman Martyrology. Both the instruction on enculturation and the directory on popular piety and the liturgy were issued during his pontificate. In 2 documents issued late in his pontificate, Liturgical Authenticam and Redemptio Sacramentum, we see a considered concern about the lack of genuine implication and application of the Council's liturgical renewal. One of the issues resulting from Liturgical Authenticam was the replacing of the so-called dynamic equivalence principle of translation enshrined in a document of the Concilium group, but never issued or published in the Observatorio Romano. The principle of translation, comme le prévoit, with a more formal equivalence instead of dynamic equivalence in translation. Now translations were to reflect the genius and character of the Latin original texts of the liturgy, replacing more contemporary paraphrases. In 1984, Pope John Paul II enabled diocesan bishops to grant requests for Mass celebrated according to the Missal of 1962. The Catholics requested it. In 1988, Pope John Paul II issued the Motu Proprio Ecclesia Dei, which issued a wide and generous application of the previous provision and insisted that respect must be shown for the feelings of those attached to the Latin liturgical tradition. The Motu Proprio also set up the Ecclesia Dei Commission to oversee relationships between traditionalist Catholics and the Holy See, and subsequently new fraternities of priests ministering to Catholics attached to the classical Latin Rite were established. One of St. John Paul II's most important works was his publication in 2002 of a new edition of the Roman Missal. A significant number of new paragraphs were added in the work of the 2002 edition of the Roman Missal. Something like 70 more paragraphs were added to beef up, as it were, the theological introduction to the Roman Missal. In his many years of scholarly research and prodigious output, resulting in more than 60 English titles, Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI, has some significant titles on the sacred liturgy. 3 principally: Feast of Faith in 1986, A New Song for the Lord in 1997, and Spirit of the Liturgy in 2000. Checking the Vatican website over the course of his 8-year pontificate, one finds 97 entries of teachings on the liturgy by Pope Benedict XVI. His emphasis was firmly on the principle that the liturgy is God's work, not a construction of committees or of individuals. We see in his own words the broad scope for the liturgy, and I quote him: "When the whole world will have become the liturgy of God, when in its reality it will have become adoration, then it will have reached its goal. It will be whole and saved." End of quote. Pope Benedict underlined the importance of continuity for the worship of the Church, while firmly rejecting rupture with the living tradition of worship. In his apostolic letter Summorum Pontificum, issued motu proprio, that is, on his own initiative, on July 7, 2007, his emphasis on continuity extended to the expanded use of the liturgy prior to the 1970 Novus Ordo reform, so often referred to as the Old Mass. He stated that, quote, "What earlier generations held as sacred remains sacred and great for us too." The response to this initiative by the Russian Orthodox Patriarch Alexius XII is significant for Catholic credibility with the East. After Pope Benedict issued Summorum Pontificum, the Patriarch said, "Recovering and recognizing the value of ancient liturgical tradition is something we welcome. We hold very strongly to tradition. Without the faithful guardianship of liturgical tradition, the Russian Orthodox Church would not have been able to resist the period of persecution." End of quote. In the 17 months of the pontificate of Pope Francis, the Vatican website offers 16 entries of statements on the liturgy. Speaking on the 50th anniversary of the Council's Liturgy Constitution, Pope Francis said that the document was a cause for gratitude for the profound and wide-ranging renewal of liturgical life made possible by the Concilia Magisterium, and at the same time urges relaunched commitment to welcoming and more fully implementing this teaching. So this ends the summary of the work of the Roman pontiffs from St. Pius X in 1903 to Pope Francis in 2014. So some final remarks. I understand the overall theme of this 111-year period as the move by the Church to see the sacred liturgy as the true and indispensable source of the Christian spirit. This perspective shows respect and allows for personal experience, my relationship with Jesus as Lord. It allows for the place of the Bible, which is itself a principal source for the liturgy. It allows for devotions, such as the Divine Mercy, the Rosary, meditation, for works of the apostolate, and for social justice. Yet the true source of the Christian spirit is the Word of God himself, through baptism, the other sacraments, and the other rites of official prayer in the Church, and above all, the Eucharist. Combining two quotes from the documents of the Second Vatican Council, the Catechism of the Catholic Church says, the Eucharist is the source and the summit of Christian life. The other sacraments, and indeed all ecclesial ministries and works of the apostolate, are bound up with the Eucharist and are oriented toward it. For in the Blessed Eucharist is contained the whole spiritual good of the Church, namely Christ himself, our Pastor. I'm not convinced that this understanding of the true Christian spirit is either understood or accepted by the majority of those who claim to be Catholics. Secondly, popes since St. Pius X have presented the liturgy as God's will, as a given, not something created and imposed. I'm not convinced that this is understood by many people of goodwill in the Church who see themselves as creators of the liturgy. To this end, when people thank me for a moving funeral or a wedding, I always reply, well, it's all in the Church's books. My intention is to maintain that the liturgy is a given, not an exercise in creativity. Thirdly, popes have emphasized that the liturgy is a treasure of great value and beauty in its texts, its rites, its music, and the architecture and art which it has inspired. There is an invitation for each generation to discover these treasures anew and to be formed by them as they come to life in divine worship. 4, encouragement and participation of all the faithful, from the newly baptized to the Pope of Rome, is required by the liturgy. The participation is actual. It is expressed in mind and heart, and in voice and in body. Participation is always to be internal. The mind and heart are always to be engaged. And as appropriate, the voice and the body will express external participation as well. I have a concern that in some quarters, actual participation is understood only as being active vocal participation. 5, all the popes have spoken of the treasury of sacred music as being the greatest of the sacred arts. All have held up Gregorian chant as the model for truly sacred music, while allowing for the use of other appropriate musical forms to clothe and express the sacred texts, to make them speak more effectively and engage the people in praying them with greater unanimity than merely spoken texts. They have given the criteria by which music may be judged as sacred. Firstly, that it is concerned with the actual text of the liturgy, and that it has a holiness, a sacredness, and a lack of profanity about it. Secondly, that it is sound and worthy in form, and that expresses a true artistry. Thirdly, that it has a certain universality about it, so that anyone of any culture who hears the music of the liturgy would not be repulsed. 6. The popes have underlined the great importance of liturgical formation for seminarians, religious, and the faithful generally. Liturgical catechesis is to be promoted at every level among the faithful, and solid liturgical study under theological, historical, biblical, canonical, and cultural headings is to be a major study in every program of priestly and religious formation. And finally, number 7, deliberate and adequate liturgical formation is to be provided for musicians, artists, craftsmen, and architects who produce contributions to the sacred liturgy. I think much remains to be done if the liturgical movement is to realize its true possibilities. Thank you.
I want to thank Father William for an outstanding presentation this evening. He has come a long way. He's come from Ireland to give the seminarians a day of recollection and to present this lecture this evening. And he will be going on to Orange County, California. So we don't want to work him too hard, but we might ask for just a few questions this evening, but maybe very few questions. So maybe we'll take about 3 or 4 questions if anyone has them for Father William.
I spoke for an hour. Any questions? Yes.
What the heck happened then? Why can't we?
What happened?
What happened?
What happened? Well, I don't know. I don't know what happened. I think a lot of things happened. I mean, basically, probably an inability to hear all that was said and all that was taught, and the great energy and clarity, really, of the teaching is there. I think a lot of people bring their own opinions and things like that. But, it's just probably a lack of real understanding of the sources and respect.
If it was done like those popes said, the churches would be full. When they had a liturgical, they had it here in Cincinnati one year, and the group, it was a musical thing for the whole United States, and they had Gregorian chant. They wanted to do the beautiful music at Old St. Mary's. I took my nephew there that lives in New Jersey, who listened to rap stuff. Well, it's not, they didn't have rap then, but he listened to that horrible music. He was a little kid, and when I took him to Mass and all the practice, he said that was the most beautiful thing he's ever heard, and he'll never hear it again.
You might.
He's never heard it.
I think you will. Yes. Come on. Yes.
When it's a question about in regards to like different cultures, so like say like an African culture or a Hispanic culture that kind of incorporate some of those types of music in it, does the church say anything on that? Like, you know, like we always hear, well, it's, you know, like the Latin isn't okay because like that's not really cultural, but the, you know, like the drums for and the dancing and the African masses is okay because that's a cultural thing. So has there ever been anything like really said about that?
Yeah, I mean, there are documents on enculturation and what the limits of it are and what has to be properly understood. And so kind of a sacredness of form even within the given culture, you know. You know, I think there are criteria which would apply, while there is a considerable allowance for, you know, some level of enculturation, you know. It's a thorny area, certainly. You know, the gospel has to speak, you know, to all people, you know, and they have to worship the Lord with their own genius, as it were, you know. But there are forms within the cultures which are sacred, and they would be forms that you would use. Now, I believe, for example, at the Basilica in Guadalupe, the mariachis are never allowed inside the basilica. You know, they sing church music, you know, in the basilica. So, you know, there are, and some of that music it's in Spanish and so on. There are musical forms which are appropriate. I have known some Hispanic people in the States that have said they feel that sometimes what we do in Hispanic liturgy is patronizing to them. You know, that they think it's kind of maybe more like, oh, those poor things, they need this, you know, whatever. And they don't always feel completely at home with it, you know. So, you know, it's a thorny question to come up with. But there are, you know, there are principles, there are guides, and there is an awareness of all of that. And there are many people of goodwill that don't quite get things right. You know? I hope that's. Oh, actually, good. Yes. Yeah.
I just have one question. You mentioned hopefully the 13th at the beginning of your talk. Why was that prayer, in specific, taken out? And why is there such a pushback from priests to reinstate that prayer when our church is in such dire straits?
Well, so as I said, the origin of the Leonine prayers was for the restoration of the temporal power of the papacy. So you had the papal states, you know, within Italy, and you know they were occupied, and so on. There's a whole political struggle. So the motivation of those prayers was that the church would get its property back, right? And then later, the idea of prayer for the conversion of Russia became the motivation. And they were often called the prayers for the conversion of Russia, the Leonine prayers. I think there's an idea, sometimes you get the impression that the sacred liturgy is insufficient, that people have to put all kinds of appendages on the liturgy because they seem to say it isn't enough. You know, like in some places you can hardly have Mass unless the rosary is being said first. Like, and there's nothing wrong with saying the rosary, it's a wonderful thing. So I think the Mass stands on its own. I know the Mass stands on its own merits, you know, and so to free up, in a sense, I think to free up the liturgical action from cluttering it too much, you know. The Leonine prayers are good prayers, and they can be prayed, but I don't think they should be tacked on at the end of every Mass, and even Pope Leo didn't require that. It was only low Mass. It was never done at high Mass. You know, it was just a low Mass thing that the Leonine prayers would say.
Right, you said for property, okay? Our Holy Eucharist was stolen in Oklahoma. And if we think by any means that Eucharist is still not there, another one isn't, that's our property. We should be praying for our property, which is the Holy Eucharist, correct? Because that's the essence of our Mass.
Yeah, but there's times and ways to pray. And, you know, I mean, the liturgy stands by itself. It's
right. This is a part of liturgy. It would be at the end of Mass, at the end of the liturgy.
Yeah, I would agree with the 1965 suppression of the Leonine prayers, and I can understand why. I understand what you're saying. I don't agree with you, but we can all have our opinion. But I don't like the idea that the sacred liturgy can't stand by itself.
But you're not saying that it doesn't need protection, right?
Of course it needs protection.
Okay, so St.
It needs
Michael in the
protection
book of
from
Matthew
clutter as well.
But in the book of Matthew, even Jesus Christ said on the Mount of Olives, do you think I cannot appeal to my Father who will send more than 12 legions of angels to my defense? So even then, he was saying, I have to appeal to my Father, which we have to appeal to the Father for the protection of the Holy Eucharist. Yep. For those of us who believe that it truly is the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus Christ.
Sure, we all do. I think everyone in this room does tonight. I'd be surprised if anyone didn't. But that you have to tack that on to the end of every Mass, I'm sorry, I can't agree with that. You know, the church doesn't require it.
One last question.
I was just going to comment on your comment because I totally agree and believe in that. But as a mother of children, teenagers down, I have that responsibility to teach them what you're saying. I don't need the pastor to agree with me and put it in the Mass. We sit in Neo after Mass. I teach them that. My husband kneels with us, and we say those prayers. It might not be the best scenario you're saying where a priest is doing it, but it's an obligation of mine because I agree with you to teach my children, niece or nephew, tell my mom why I still kneel at the end of Mass over my father's prayer book and say I'm praying these for the church. So maybe that helps. Maybe you to know that there are those of us with you praying those prayers across the country for not only Oklahoma but every day. But I agree, it'd be nice to have a pastor that might agree with me, but he doesn't have to agree with me.
I'm not asking him to agree.
That's a good comment. Mrs. Ball, you had your hand up.
Yes, I just wanted to know your opinion on the World Youth Day masses. I think in the beginning when it started it was a good premise, but anymore I can't even bear to watch them because I really feel that there's such an abuse of the liturgy in those.
Yes, I understand. I mean, you know, and I think, again, it's a little bit patronizing that young people can't attend a well-formed liturgy that is, you know, specified by the church's, you know, legislation, you know, appropriately, that you have to break the rules in order to engage. I just don't believe that's necessary. You know,
What are we teaching them in the long run? You know, what are we teaching them by this kind of
yeah, I mean, you know, it's sad when these things happen at a papal mass, you know, and you know, the Pope even doesn't have absolute control over everything that happens when the liturgy is celebrated. I mean, they can even put out directives. I was one of the MCs at a papal mass in Australia in 1987. And there were very clear directives given, and I was at a meeting and we knew what was told. And it came to just about half an hour before the papal mass in Perth in Western Australia. And there was this great bunch of floral arrangement, you know, trees and, you know, like plants and everything, between the concelebrants and the altar. And there was a very clear directive, there was to be nothing separating those who are concelebrating from the altar, like no barrier. And here was this whole array of plants. And the papal MC came down and said, what are these doing? He had a look around, you know, half an hour. He said, what are these doing here? He said, oh, well, you know, we thought they looked nice, and blah, 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 you know. And so he said, they will have to be removed before the Holy Father can begin. Oh, you know, like I thought you asked their grandma, you know. And so, you know, some guys came in, it took them about 3 or 4 minutes, and they were removed. And there was no division between the concelebrants and the Pope as the principal celebrant. If they had followed the directions from the first place, it wouldn't have been necessary to have a correction. So, you know, some of the things that happen at these occasions, I mean, they sometimes in seminaries use the amusing term about the liturgical police, you know. But sometimes you actually need liturgical police to see that, you know, it's on such an occasion. There's no guarantee that the directives are going to be actually fulfilled. Thank you.
Thank you very much.